I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada to introduce an address by the head of government.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's my pleasure to introduce to the Assembly my Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau, who will be speaking to us by means of a pre-recorded statement.
Mr. President, fellow delegates, my friends, thank you for the opportunity to address this Assembly. Like many of you, I've spoken in this forum before, but never like this, at a time like this. The world is in crisis. And not just because of the last few months, not just because of COVID-19, but because of the last few decades, and because of us. This is our wake-up call, and we cannot ignore it. Time and time again, history has shown us that the price for turning away, for failing to act, is much too high. Our parents and grandparents remember all too well what things were like in the 30s and the 40s. Economies collapsed. Governments and systems of government crumbled. Millions died. That was the world they faced. That was the challenge they had to meet. And this is what they did about it.
Our parents and grandparents chose to get back up on their feet and rebuild. They created multilateral institutions such as the United Nations. They created international financial institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and other Bretton Woods institutions. And they laid the foundations of a rules-based international order, which allowed us to enjoy an unprecedented period of shared prosperity during the second half of the 20th century.
We had a generation that learned from crisis and set us on a better path. In their era, those systems worked. But that was 50, 60, 70 years ago. Today, all those institutions no longer serve us well enough on what they were designed for: defending multilateralism and international law, protecting human rights and open markets. That is what the crisis of COVID-19 has shown beyond a shadow of a doubt, that things have to change. And not just on the world stage, but at home too. Nous n'en faisons pas.
We do not do enough for the most vulnerable, whether these are older persons who are dying in care homes, or homeless people for whom every evening is a struggle. We are not going far enough to eliminate systemic injustice, whether this be racism against black or indigenous peoples, homophobia or sexism. In the difficulties of our citizens, we can see reflected the failures of our institutions, of our world. With the pandemic having decimated their economies and their basic services, many countries are now on the brink of the abyss. This is what I heard from so many of you during the Financing for Development meeting that Canada organised last spring, with the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres and the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness. We must do more so that the children of the world are fed and that they can go to school. If we do not do this, the consequences will be disastrous. We are facing a global humanitarian crisis. And the most worrisome part of all this is that this pandemic and the crises it has shone a spotlight on is not even the greatest threat that we face.
Our world is facing a climate reckoning. We are at this point because of our collective inability over the past decades to make the tough decisions and sacrifices needed to fight climate change and save future generations. The pandemic has not changed that. Our shared failures have continued, and our citizens are paying the price. We need a new way of thinking on climate, on inequality, on health. Because the way we're doing things just isn't working well enough. Too often, concerted action is blocked. The needs of our citizens are denied, as a result of gridlock at decision-making bodies. And why? Because there are few consequences for countries that ignore international rules, for regimes that think might makes right. Few consequences for places where opposition figures are being poisoned while cyber tools and disinformation are being used to destabilize democracies. Few consequences when innocent citizens are arbitrarily detained and fundamental freedoms are repressed, when a plane of civilians is shot from the sky, when women's rights are not treated as human rights, when no one has any rights at all. We are in deadlock. The international approach we've relied on since the second half of the 20th century was built on an understanding that countries would work together. But now those same countries are looking inward and are divided. We need to recognize where we are. The system is broken. The world is in crisis. And things are about to get much worse unless we change. Right now, we have a chance, not a big chance, but a chance to shift course, to realize that the only way through this is together. Putting some people ahead of others does not work. A healthier, cleaner, more equal future cannot be the privilege of a lucky few. It must be the right of us all.
The only way of resolving this, the only way of building a better future for our children and our grandchildren is by working together, by defending one another, regardless of the lines drawn on our maps. The Rohingyas in Myanmar, the demonstrations in Belarus, the Lebanese people, these citizens arbitrarily held in China, indigenous peoples in Canada and throughout the world. A real and constructive global cooperation is the only way to move forward. But who are we to ask for that? Canada is not a country which can bring much pressure to bear in these major international issues. Like so many others, we are subject to the whims of the superpowers. But as Canadians, we know that we are not alone.
As Canadians, a trading nation where we trace our origins to every corner of the planet, we know that we are in this together. And I know other countries, your countries, see this too. Instead of hunkering down and hoping that we come out the other side okay, let's remember that we're all in this together. Instead of crossing our fingers and hoping that the big powers will figure this out, let's look at what we can do to make a difference together. Let's use our shared power not just to get a vaccine, but to get it out to everyone. Let us be inspired by our citizens' call to restore the global economy while we tackle climate change. In other words, let's not wait for someone else to act. Let's do it ourselves. Each one of us here in these United Nations, each one of us uniting around a shared future. Canada has a long history in peacekeeping, and we will continue to step up and continue to move the dial on lasting peace by empowering women. Canada has always supported the work of agencies like UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and the UNHCR. Not only will we keep supporting these efforts, we'll keep increasing our international assistance budget every year. There's still so much more to be done.
In the four corners of the planet, children are wearing masks to go to school or are not going to school at all. Older people are dying. Demonstrators are being killed. The sea levels are rising and the forests are burning. Those who think only of themselves are continuing to exacerbate inequalities and conflicts. Now is the time for us, as the United Nations, to join forces and do what we were created to do. Assure peace and security, and avoid global crises. Today we are engaged in a combat unlike others, a combat against an invisible virus, At the same time, we are fighting against the consequences of our own actions, which have caused the carbon levels in the atmosphere to reach unsustainable levels.
Everywhere around the world, people are becoming mindful of this reality. They're refusing to accept inequality. They're refusing to close their eyes to the peril we're facing. Our citizens will no longer shrug off as someone else's problem a failing status quo. And that's a good thing, because there is the path forward. After a wildfire rips through a forest, life adjusts and begins anew. After an earthquake hits a city, people work together and rebuild. As we face these layers of crises, this is what we must do. We must understand our opportunities and our responsibilities to take real action together, to protect each other, to support each other. If we meet this moment, if we rise to this challenge, I know that, like our grandparents did 70 years ago, we will lay the foundations of a better world.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of Canada for this